and information science toward dismantling systematic hegemonies on cultural bias. So, Dr. Mehra, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the generous introduction. Let me pull up my share and see if it works for a minute. Can you see the slides and can you hear me speak?
Yes, yes,
Perfect. Thank you.
perfect.
Well, good afternoon to all of you from Birmingham, Alabama. As you know, this historical city is the cradle of civil rights movement that was a political campaign and grassroots initiative from 1954 to 1968 to abolish institutional racial segregation, discrimination, and white racial power abuse throughout the United States. A struggle against racism that exists even today, for social justice and social advocacy for Black Americans and all of us immigrants and others as racial ethnic minorities. So the title of my talk, Social Justice and Action Research in Library Information Science, dismantling systemic hegemonies and cultural bias, is relevant first from the geographical context. And in terms of national issues, as our LIS leaders, politicians, and administrators distance themselves from diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility language to appease their conservative donors and vote bank constituencies, the work seems even more important. I want to share my deep appreciation and sincere thank you to the organizers of the Social Justice Lecture Series, Middle East Librarians Association, for this incredible opportunity to speak with you. In today's talk, I will be discussing social justice and action research intersections across my recent work in LIS. In the process, I would then provide a critical positionality to my own voice towards strategic actions that can be taken to dismantle systemic hegemonies and cultural bias. I will also challenge the recent neoliberal commodification surrounding EDI language and topics in LIS. The unethical distancing in LIS from its own bias, historical baggage of passivity, neutrality, and complacency is unacceptable without confronting the colonial and imperialist world order that still shapes its predominantly white administrative echelons of power, privilege, and performative politics. From an intersectional perspective, as a gay person of color from India, I will comment on a few select scenarios that reflect cultural bias, including the recent IFLA fiasco in mishandling the initially scheduled 2024 World Library and Information Congress in Dubai. I will discuss the dark shadows of post-positivist paradigms and exclusionary categorizations that have classified human existence and experience in closed boxes that misinform IFLA leaders as they succumb to their politically charged constituencies in response to local, regional, and international politics. As a gay person of color now in a white entrenched American South, emerging as a survivor of child abuse and domestic violence in India, I have used my neurodivergent and atypical non-white voice as a mode of resistance and empowerment to challenge the hegemonies that diminish our human dignity and human worth. I'm privileged to channelize now what flows through my cultural and psychological veins as I speak up and speak out in order to make us all uncomfortable to become stronger as human beings. There is a need to advance efforts that decenter white privilege, dismantle white oppressions in a predominantly white-centric majority, Anglo-Eurocentric privilege, challenge policies and practices that perpetuate systemic racism and other isms to integrate mechanisms of action-oriented accountabilities beyond lip service via information-related work that make people take responsibility for their intentional or unintentional racialized behaviors when it emerges as systemic patterns. This talk is one small step in that regard to implement authentic anti-racist praxis within white and female-dominated professional groupings in LIS and its tilt towards Anglo-Euro centrality, and all that is part of our profession. So, quick outline here, touching upon my positionality, uh, talking about the legacy of biases in the academy and setting the scope of the field with an introduction to some key terms and vocabularies. I will provide a glimpse through specific projects and examples, and then provide a commentary on issues of cultural bias that address aspects of land acknowledgement issues, civil rights Act of 1964, which has politically set one mistreated group against the other, that is, white women versus people of color, IFLA mishandling of the 2024 situation, and then a recent occurrence with Emerald, that I'm a book series editor for the advances in librarianship, as well as touch upon some questions moving forward. So I've been privileged to have developed integrate my personal and professional streams of life experience to establish a national and international reputation as a scholar and advocate for underserved populations in librarianship and information science as a profession, engage in critical activist scholarship towards a more inclusive and just society that includes more than 180 peer-reviewed authored, co-authored publications on EDI-related matters, serving as the book editor for Advances in Librarianship, currently on the board of various prestigious journals, as well as edited various special issues on EDI and international content for various journals over the years. Here you can see a word cloud of some of my work that includes collaborations with various racial ethnic minorities, international communities in the diaspora, sexual minorities, rural librarians, small businesses, and others to represent their experiences and perspectives in shaping the design and development of community-based systems and services. As you can see, my educational trajectory is also not straight. And then jokes aside, my inability not fit into boxes, building identities across perceived dichotomies, challenge hegemonies, and attacks to human dignity is connected to my resistance to male patriarchal heteronormative mores. And then my strength as a neurodivergent thinker, communicator of intersectional discourse that I bring to you today through a bachelor's degree training in architecture made me sensitive to vernacular design, that is the environment, local materials, sustainability. My master's in library and in landscape architecture provided opportunities to scholarship of behavior and cultural factors shaping design, participatory and community responsive solutions. Area studies in South Asian and Middle Eastern studies explored options of metadata organizational systems for multimedia resources with non-Anglo-Euro origins, and came together in library and information studies through a PhD exploring limited theories, methods, knowledge, and material in the LIS disciplines that provided the foundations for challenging and integrating social justice that begins very much at home and in our own backyards as we proceed further and outwards to greater community impact and outcomes. So hold on to the streams of your trousers and hems of your skirts, for this is going to be a bumpy ride. And so moving on to the legacy of biases in the academy, you have the history of academic institutions and that have been exclusionary, elitist, closed doors of privilege open to white men and then to white women, and doors were open to people of color only very recently. For example, the privileged all-white American universities were still resistant to inclusiveness. And in 1978, very recent, the Office for Civil Rights published the revised criteria specifying the ingredients of acceptable plans to desegregate state systems of public higher education. Since then, the uncomfortable truths about race, slavery, and predominantly white American academy have been complex, contested, and extremely problematic. I'm bringing this up because these dysfunction elements have been replicated and perpetuated throughout the world without any question. The implication for this is that power imbalances and social inequities that were not directly experiences or were encountered in a limited fashion owing to the race-based exclusion meant these realities and experiences were not considered legit as, as research. And you can read more about that in this particular article that I wrote with Dr. Lavan Gray. And so the history of exclusion and privileging solely its Anglo-Euro academic roots replicated around the world had direct influence on the development and emergence of disciplines and their knowledge domains within the natural sciences, the social sciences, the formal sciences, the professions, applied sciences, humanities, arts and design, and more, leading to insular, isolated, fragmented knowledge based on white centrality. Also, the research of these disciplines and in LIS were disconnected from external communities, having limited impact on the public that supported these public institutions via tax base. And so these disciplines, exclusionary in their nature, provided privileged positions to positivist, post-positivist, quantitative traditions that were searching for absolute objective reality, for example, in experimental labs and through biased exclusionary studies. They led to marginalization of humanist and interpretive approaches, mixed methods, action research, qualitative narratology, storytelling, social justice, ethnography, participant observations, and many more from the privileged Black boxes of what we consider library science, information science research, while including some with recognition and leaving others on the margins. And so library and information studies here, as you can see a comment on that, within the larger bias academy, primarily mimicking from solely Euro-Anglo-centric sources of the social sciences, such as sociology, anthropology, psychology, led to abstracted library and information focused theory development that did not sufficiently account initially for research about situation and context of patterns in information relevance and community engaged research. So library and information science as an interdisciplinary domain concerned only with abstracted creation, management, use of information in all its forms. And then on the other hand, we criticize that in its liberating role to seek social justice ideals in the services that they develop, however, have played a limiting role in as they were constrained by curtailing socio-political, socio-economic, and socio-cultural circumstances during different times. And so you can see the interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary influence on LIS from communication. What is communicated is information. And the definition of information is when knowledge is shared with others in particular contexts. Education, shared aspects of learning and building the vernacular of knowledge together. Humanities, service-based ethics and philosophy. Cultural studies, understanding our patrons and the context, meaning making through social, cultural, socio-economic, and political realities in which they are embedded in. Computer science, with the use of computers and emergence of information science and use of technologies, the affiliation with computer science has only got stronger. Cognitive science, cognition is the study of what we know, brain structures and mechanisms which is related to knowledge and information. Business management overlaps within financial and economic models of organization and management directives, etc. Of course, this list is not exhaustive. And so we see current focus here. You can see a snapshot of Rubin and Rubin foundation, talking about foundations of in 2004, without looking at the critical dismantling of white-centered culture or those who continue to enable and empower it for their own gain of administrative growth and career impact. And so we have then on the right-hand side, the iSchool movement, that is an international organization of 120 universities, a common interest in all aspects of research and teaching about information unites them. And that their philosophy is based on people, information technology coming together in various individual, organizational, community-wide contexts as a resistance and challenge to territorial domains with engineering, business, etc. Here, the baggage problematic replicated around the world touches upon library science as part of the cultural memory institutions, that is the study of libraries and educational librarians as bodies, curators of world knowledge involved in storage, processing, access, organization, management, retrieval, dissemination, and use of information that then have been focused on historically middle-class, white-centered, passive, neutral, and thereby weak, inward-looking privileged institutions that enable the status quo of gaps to widen between the haves and the have-nots by not being externally directed and providing efforts that included minority and underserved populations. Emerging from such a tradition, the new information science in the late 20th century also then provided a narrow, pompous conceptual space that initially ignored the reality of lived experience, the notion of impact on everyday work settings, the need to go beyond experimental labs to shape changes in the social, political, economic, contextual circumstances within which information access and other information-centered activities were embedded. And so these patterns of dysfunction were then have been replicated all around the world. And you can read more about these through this article in the Library Quarterly that explores the 6 normative phases in LIS. And we called for owning up of racialized library history, white elitist information research, exclusion in terms of LIS education, lip service, tokenism, and whatnot. Over the years, a lack of social justice was evidenced through its exclusion of people of color in its composition and service constituencies, gender inequities in salary differentials, continued privileging of post-positivist and positivist research, and a bias against interpretive humanistic approaches to our understanding. So now bringing in certain terms and vocabularies, the concept of community engaged scholarship is valuable here in terms of an effort that was initiated by campus Compact in 2016, a national coalition of 1,100 institutions committed to the public purposes of higher ed, adopting the Carnegie Community Engaged classification, defined as collaboration between institutions of higher education and their larger communities, local, regional, state, national, international, for mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources, unquote. And so here you also then see on the right, on the left-hand side, Ernest Boyer's model from the 1990s, applying the community engaged scholarship model. Engagement can occur at research, teaching, service. Another way to visualize this is applying information-related practices to challenge power imbalances that have silenced voices to support fairness, equality, equity, justice for underserved population, making such efforts meaningful, relevant, and valid. So here is a screenshot of some of my classes and their websites, which can be available through my website, where students partner with community-based agencies outside the academy and their workplaces to establish tangible products that are developed on the websites related with integration of information-related work via those partnerships that explore topics of social justice and diversity leadership, community engaged scholarship, collection development, information organization, grant writing, and more. And so what does social justice look like in the field of information? This is an approach that then focuses upon how to make our profession more proactive in promoting activism and advocacy to support fairness, justice, equity, change agency, and community development via information-related work with and on behalf of all people, especially those considered on society's margins. And an impact-driven framework then expects information professionals to better operationalize these principles in ways that are fair, just, inclusive, and equitable. And then the push is towards community-based partnerships and impacts that are intentional, that is deliberate, systematic, meaning rigorous, constructive, meaning asset-based, action-oriented, and outcome-driven. So here you can see a collection of case studies that were presented in this book that I edited that implement social justice as a design strategy to generate community-wide changes through action-oriented establishment of relevant outcomes via information-related work. The concept of action research is also relevant here as reflected in the title of the talk today, in terms of addressing practical concerns of people in an immediate problematic situation and adding to the body of world knowledge that is meeting the goals of social science via joint collaboration in ethically, mutually acceptable frameworks. That is, outcome-based results, providing suggestions for progressive change, and the criteria to measure such action research is based on credibility, transferability, dependability, and conformability. And some of the characters included in various projects touch upon decentralization, deregulation, cooperativeness in order to make real transformations happen while redefining relationships between institutions and people of power and privilege. So now specific examples, I will touch upon glimpses of some projects that were enacted out from 1995 to 2017 and then beyond. And some of the key themes here are about voice, that is a topic from multiculturalism, resistance to the normative in the academy and its abstracted theories. That is, does not include people of color and their everyday realities, as well as the topic of intersectionality, that is, our lived experiences are shaped by interlocking forms of privileges and oppressions, owing to, for me, intersectionality in terms of race, ethnicity, immigrant status, gender, sex, sexual orientation, education, class, income, and more. And their cultural challenges, potential opportunities, identities, and or conditioning, as well as the topic of critical narratology, that is narrative building, to decenter traditionally unquestioned, imbalanced power dynamics attributed to positivist, post-positivist work, and quantification, and more. For example, when people who have not directly experienced social inequities and imbalanced power dynamics through the lens of race, ethnicity in the United States and elsewhere, and through other lenses, proclaim EDI initiatives, these fall terribly short because they are based on abstracted theoretical notions without direct experience. So you can see a list of various projects, the underserved population, the context of the research, the information context and framework that was adopted, and the methods as well as timeline, touching upon working with rural libraries in the southern and central Appalachian regions, small businesses and public libraries, LGBTQ communities, librarians and information professionals in India, cross-cultural faculty and students, public librarians serving people living with HIV/AIDS, LGBTQ South Asians, international students. And on this slide, going backwards to when I came to the US in 1994, African American women, students, academic libraries serving people with HIV/AIDS. This was, of course, way back, as you can see, when it was still a very taboo topic in 2006. International doctoral students, Puerto Rican community, high school citizen scientists, African American women, underrepresented global art and architecture, faculty members, minority residents in East St. Louis, etc. So here I will now start touching upon glimpses of more recent work. And here you can see an impact-driven framework to operationalize social justice in the field of information and communication technologies for development. That is a subcategory within our information studies. And so here you can see a framework that captures the width, why, how, internally exploring how we can orchestrate these, and externally towards what, which then brings in elements of social justice and social equity right throughout the conceptualization and implementation of various projects. In this paper, one had a chance to explore Ranganathan's, the father of librarianship, from a 21st century perspective in analyzing Ranganathan's laws in relation to social justice laws in librarianship. And so from the first law of social justice, that is, the books are to be used, one provided a translation to that in terms of information is for equitable use to make an impact via social justice changes in people's everyday lives. To the fifth law, a library is a growing organism too. Information institution situates its positionality in its privilege and is there to serve. Further going down some more examples, in this particular project that was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, we looked at doing a gap analysis between small businesses and public librarians in the state of Tennessee. And we came up with a model exploring their model of information seeking behaviors, that is use and user-based model, which looked at who the user was, what their information needs were, how did that translate it into information use based on existing use of the public library and proposed use of the public library through the development of a small business public library toolkit. And so here on this slide, you can see, based on the data that was collected, what the blueprint design of a small business public library toolkit look like in terms of various categories of information and fields that would operationalize that in the form of a database design that would provide access to some of the resources that are identified. And on the right-hand side, you have, of course, the methodology that was adopted from assessment data, interviews, focus groups, surveys, to workshop design, where people got together to establish plan, and then further element of operationalizing and finding resources, state level money, including state library boards and others, to be able to operationalize and implement some parts of this framework. In this particular grant, again supported by the Institute for Museum and Library Services, we did an assessment of Southern and Central Appalachian libraries and librarians in the rural areas and explored how are they stepping outside their comfort zones to engage with various stakeholders related to agriculture, diversity, economy, education, environment, government, health, information technology, law and justice. Further down, you had manufacturing, social welfare, and other aspects of their work, looking at what were the nature of these collaborations, who were the partners and collaborators, what were the challenges that the rural librarians encountered, and what were some of the positive outcomes that emerged from some of these initiatives. Further extension of that same study reported related with information technologies. And we looked at, within the rural areas, how deficit aspects of marginalization, that is the lacking oh, this is not enough. There is limited resources available. There's limited social justice initiatives happening. How can we, through information technology, through information related work, translate that into constructive asset development within the marginalized context in terms of community building, collective identity formation, communities coming together to solve problems, sustaining stakeholder engagement, and other attributes that you can see listed there. In this particular project, how are libraries supporting sustained development in terms of improvements in the community health was a recent study in the focus on 230 public libraries in the state of Alabama and their websites and what they were saying there about addressing the opioid crisis. And so you can see on the right-hand side a taxonomic framework of the different type of topics and offerings and services that the rural libraries and rural libraries and others were involved in all these different 230 libraries around the state. And then on the left hand side is specific illustrative examples of initiatives that were getting enacted out in those public library settings. Now, this study captures within the COVID environment that we've seen over the past 3 years and the global pandemic, that crisis that emerged, how are libraries reclaiming their role as social justice warriors during Ms. Rona's global pandemic crisis, again, with various topic headings such as prevention through information, information for diagnosis, information as a prognosis tool, information treatment, recovery with information, information for trauma-focused care, information resilience, with specific examples listed there of particular projects that various types of libraries were involved in. The example here, you can see the partnerships with the US Department of State Diplomacy Lab program, where students at the University of Tennessee working with me were engaged in foreign policy intervention, foreign policy formulations and intervention, partnering with advocacy groups in these parts of the world. And so the first project was on international correction reform and human rights protection for LGBT populations in Latin America and Africa. And then we had the and we built GIS tools to represent knowledge and information and examples of advocacy work through that tool, visualize dynamic interactive. And the second project was mapping non-conforming LGBTI cultural representations of difference in historical sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, the publications that emerged from there. Some of the local efforts in action research with public libraries in Alabama: Don't Say Gay in Alabama, taxonomic framework or LGBTQ information services in public libraries. Further, we also focused on the representation of women's concerns with Bhaiya Jabbar, who is one of our members in our audience, who's been working with me for many years as a doctoral student. And then, of course, also people who are differently abled in Alabama's public libraries, and looking at the specific illustrative examples, a taxonomic framework, and how then we were able to translate some of that with interactions and conversations with the state library, Alabama State Public Library Services, and be able to implement some of these elements that were suggested. On this slide, you can see the approach is similar, but the content is different in relation to programming and information support services for LGBTQ populations, a taxonomic framework that then captures an illustrative examples that are listed on the right-hand side. On the current grant, which is currently happening with Institute for Museum and Library Services, we are involved in first assessment, planning, and operationalizing of civic engagement for racial justice in public libraries in the South. So 16 regions, 16 states in the United States of America and Washington, D.C., 17 regions. We are collecting feedback from various partners and public librarians all around this region in looking at what are the issues of racism that they encounter, what are some of the examples of anti-racist programs that they are involved in, and how does that translate into workshops delivered to identify goals, objectives, resources, activities, which falls within strategic planning, so that in the third year, we will operationalize and implement some of these efforts. And it is informed by an abstracted framework of theory of change. That is, you analyze a context, look at a series of events, what are some of the underlying assumptions, specific outcomes that can emerge, immediate and long term, and then of course that's implemented through a logic model. A screenshot of that you can see on the right hand side, which connects your system centric elements of needs, inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact. In these two other grant projects that are also currently happening, the first one is coming up with training of Black, Indigenous, and people of color community embedded archivists, paraprofessionals, and providing them an online master's degree program where they take courses to develop connections between archival practice and social justice through tangible products that they develop. The last project listed at the bottom here, Libraries Count, is a partnership with East Tennessee State University and the University of Alabama, where we are developing co-developing a professional learning program online to build capacity of library staff to support underserved, minority, and diverse young children with their families in mathematics education. So now I'm going to move to commentary, and within the limited time that I have available, so that then I can open up the floor for questions and interactions on these matters. First, the issue of cultural bias. What does it mean? And not necessarily going into the details, cultural bias, as all of us know and have experienced, is an interpretation and judgment of phenomena by the standards of one own culture that is considered a problem in the social and human sciences, with implications for sociology, psychology, anthropology, history, economics, and other disciplines with their wide centrality. In neoliberal capitalism, where everything is of value, right? And static exclusionary categorization, classifying human existence in closed boxes, cultural bias has played a very problematic role in LIS and beyond. Here, I just want to note that culture is understood in the broadest sense as values, beliefs, behaviors, actions of different groups beyond racial, ethnic, national boundaries, distinguishing human beings based on, of course, aspects of socio-demographic characteristics, identity markers, and more. So the issue of land acknowledgement is an important aspect, as you know, that we have so-called liberal educators and administrators reference land acknowledgement statements as simplified as they think, yet powerful tools of showing respect and step towards correcting the stories and practices that erase indigenous people's history and culture, and towards inviting and honoring the truth. Acknowledgement by itself is a small gesture. It becomes meaningful only when coupled with authentic relationships and informed action. So here, the first statement I presented here from the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, that includes, quote, the United States has achieved many great things, but it also has a complex history with dark and cruel periods, including the mistreatment of Native Americans, taking of the great deal of their land. And while we cannot change the past, public land grant universities have had and will continue to be focused on building a better future for everyone. Public and land grant universities have a responsibility to continue to provide opportunities for Native American students while working to appropriately and respectably serve ready, willing partners to help address new challenges and needs, unquote. This needs to be made real by direct owning of colonizing and human abuses and what we gained from these atrocities. What are we doing in terms of actions of returning back retribution, direct and indirect, and how we still gaining from these lip service returning back gestures? So here you see the theater, Tuscaloosa, Shelton State Community College in Alabama, providing an indigenous land acknowledgement adopted by the Board of Directors in 2020 that recognizes that organization, infrastructure, and larger Tuscaloosa community are built on Chautauqua lands, while the surrounding region encompasses Creek territories as well. The history of many native nations are deeply rooted in Alabama, while the present and future lives of neighbors, including the Porch Creek, Mississippi, Choctaws, and other tribal communities, remain closely connected to the land. So now my question, within the neoliberal commodification of EDI topic, we see such many statements which come across as lip service when there are few efforts of reconciliation, retribution, decolonization actions, and identifications of specific strategies to dismantle and rectify wrongdoing. And then, of course, you will find this really tragic that the University of Alabama has a very lip service. Well, talk about that other side of lip service where we have topics listed such as University of Alabama Lands and Real Estate Services Division of Finance and Operations, University of Alabama Land Endowment. And of course, this does not account for how the university grabbed the land from Native Americans prior to 1884, when in 1832, after Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, the Creek National Council ceded its remaining land east of Mississippi to United States settlers. Settlers had already attempted to encroach on the territory. Thousands more Native American people were forced to leave during the Sale of Tears in 1834. So here on the website, you have all these developments that took place in 1884 onwards, when the US Congress voted to grant the university 46,000 acres of land to increase its endowment. These public lands were repayment for the destruction of the campus during the Civil War, with topics like minerals, forestry, real estate services, and more. No reference has been made to how the land was taken from the indigenous population. This is a great example of whitewashing the white brutalities and telling of white sanitized histories. Also, it represents how entrenched white institutions of privileges function. It is the way it is, and we are not going to change about it. That's the message. It reminds me of a recent address during a reception at one of the events for new faculty, where a top university administrator shared his excitement while accepting his pro use of language about the possibilities for the university to move forward from its parochial roots, and describing this opportunity for the academic enterprise as a path to colonize the community in responding to the challenges while coping and sustaining the tremendous growth. Owning of the poor language and still using it reflected a conscious or subconscious notion that this is the reality and it is the way that it is and probably not going to change. It symbolizes an instance of white male privilege and entrenchment of the ways that often are expected and hoped that it will never change. So now going to the second point here about Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so we recognize racism and intersecting with patriarchy within the interrelating and intersecting with other isms as a global disease that we have inherited owing to dysfunctions of the human condition. In the United States and around the world, as human beings, we experience ignorance and power imbalances. And that has caused lifelong damage to the body, mind, heart, and soul, and requires intentional, systematic efforts to help each other as we shall overcome together or not. And so here the topic of intersectionality as an understanding of interlocking privileges and oppressions that we encounter as compared to these separated, isolated, fragmented approaches that we've seen in the past. And you can see more about the topic of intersectionality within a recent publication. But this helps us understand the question, why are men and women so few in our field of information in library studies, etc.? So we often wonder and question that. So why? The numbers first speak for itself. And in this 2021 report by the Association for Library and Information Science Education, and since then I've critiqued this even more, or the newer reports that have emerged, the categorization information that is provided is related with race. Hispanic of any race, 3%, American Indians, 0%, Asian, 14%, Black or African American, 4%, Native Hawaiian, 2%, white, 59%, etc. And so here, there is no understanding of intersectionality. Men of color and women of color do not exist beyond a lumped category of gender or race, ethnicity. And of course, there'll be much more that one has criticized here, but I will go into my opinion on the underlying aspect related to that, where you see it is easy to forget that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the United States was legally enacted out not very long ago to ban employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, abolish disparate voter registration applications, force public library school desegregation, and establish racial desegregation of public accommodations. Now, Sally Cohen and others talk about how affirmative action has helped white women than anyone else with this lumping of all these different categories into one bucket. And so several times I myself have encountered leadership opportunities in LIS and the academy filled with white women. The predominance of race and race of whiteness pervade. It was always the top category of white men, everything else falling into this lumpiness of maintaining the status quo of white male privilege, staying intact. Two people of Asian origins from the same country, even when they're American citizens, could not be selected for leadership opportunities in the same cohort, even though there were many white men and women in the same leadership positions, and the rule was not applied to them. Then an Asian woman will always get selected over the Asian man because, of course, patriarchy is considered, quote unquote, a bigger problem, race being the same for both. But of course, only measured in simplified, problematic, post positivist modes of measurement. So the Asian man cannot do anything, however, what level of credentials he might bring to the table to overcome the gender card that was often thrown on his face several times, while white men administrators who could then continue occupying many seats as they wanted. And so here an explanation, and of course, connecting to white females in allied education, rightly complaining about the privilege bestowed on white males in the profession and the world at large. However, when some of them took on leadership positions in administration and management, they ended up replicating similar systemic abuses and oppressions such as invisibility, microaggressions, erasure, power abuse, and whatnot towards men and women of color in their midst. So an explanation about that was quite meaningful for me to understand in relation to the work of Paulo Freire, a Brazilian political activist who's written in The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But almost always, during the initial stage of the struggle, the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors or sub-oppressors. The very structure of their thought has been conditioned by the contradictions or the concrete existential situation by which they are shaped, unquote. And then the last one, although the situation of oppression is a dehumanizing and dehumanized one, totality affecting both the oppressors and whom they oppress, it is the latter who must, from their stifled humanity, wage for both the struggle for a fuller humanity. The oppressor.
Dr. Mehra, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can you please wrap it up so we can leave some time for questions?
I appreciate. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Not at all. Not at all. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so
I'm
much.
going to go into the last few comments here about human rights, and here's some definitions and explanations about those, as well as the IFLA condition, which ended up, I called it a fiasco because the way that the timeline projected itself, they did not seek feedback from their special interest group LGBTQ users, first of all, and then opened up for comments where everybody jumped into the bandwagon to say, no, no, no. Yet there was a great opportunity for putting pressure on the United Arab Emirates to provide protection for all its people and respect the humanity of all its people. So it was an opportunity that was lost because one could have played a role in some ways to be able to make the end result happen. And so that I will stop on that and maybe follow up with additional questions. And here is my role, my manifesto focusing on international populations and decolonizing efforts. And I've been privileged to work with Dr. Laili Saifi and have them included as a co-editor for the book that is now under development, where we challenged the international laws that publishing industry is controlled by as putting bans against certain countries and not against others. And the problem here being that it actually damages the advocacy work that is really happening on ground zero in that place by imposing these bans in a blanket manner. So I have some questions here, but I will address the last one for you to respond to me. How do we shift the hegemony of Anglo-Euro centrality in LI scholarship and the tremendous value that is assigned to these theories, methods, paradigms, research approaches, etc., that exclude value given to Asian, African, Aboriginal, Indigenous, and other resources? Plus, last one, all around the world, we replicate these dysfunctional mechanisms of Anglo-Euro centrality in LI scholarship. How do we decolonize such practices within and outside various countries? So I will close with that and appreciate your patience, and would like to have some questions. Sorry for running over the time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mehra. Aisha, can you please stop the recording? So thank you so much for this great contribution, Dr. Mehra.